Hello and welcome, everyone. I'm John M. Hawkins. The show is My Strategy, and we're coming to you live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. We're very happy to be here with you today and really glad that you could join us. My Strategy episodes are live. They're on Saturdays at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. We'd love to get your thoughts. You can send them to talk@johnmhawkins.com. That's talk@johnmhawkins.com. And this is an important week. This week, we're going to be talking about the empathy gap when walking a mile in someone's shoes. This episode, we're going to talk about judging people before walking a mile in their shoes, how the emotional state matters and sets us up. We're going to talk about the empathy gap and how it causes us to misjudge perspective. And with practice, we can help minimize this effect and make better decisions. Well, happy to be here with you today. My Strategy is a show all about personal development. And for me, Saturday is a great day of the week to reflect on my strategy. But I would hope that any day works for you. But keep in mind that your own strategy is something that you'll need to own. It's something that you'll need to reflect on, and that's why we do this show on a weekly basis. Now, the My Strategy radio show continues to grow. We're available on iHeart, iTunes, Player FM, YouTube, SoundCloud, Spreaker, and many more digital platforms. So if you'd like to listen to this show again or go listen to one of our other shows, you can find them there. You can find me on most social media platforms. My Twitter handle is @HawkinsJohn, and my website is johnmhawkins.com. So that's johnmhawkins.com for the website and HawkinsJohn for Twitter. And just like anything in life, we need to have a strategy and a plan to help us reach our goals because the best laid plans don't always work. This week, I'm looking for stories on empathy, on walking a mile in someone's shoes. Do you have any good examples, a tip or a trick? If you could send it to talk@johnmhawkins.com, I will appreciate it, and we can get that conversation started. All right, so this week we're talking about the empathy gap. I think this is important because as I was thinking about all the things going on in the world this week, in fact, 2020 has been very difficult. But as I was specifically thinking about things that happened in the past week, I started to think about how could I start to plan my own strategy? How could I start to be better equipped to respond to what is going on in this world? And a thought came to mind of walking a mile in someone else's shoes. And when I thought about walking a mile in someone else's shoes, I thought that might be the perfect way to find out perspective, to learn empathy. But as I did my research, I found that there are some problems with that approach. And so this week, we're going to be talking about it. We're going to be talking about what's called the empathy gap and how the empathy gap can actually cause very compassionate people who were in a similar situation to react poorly rather than being empathetic. And this is specific to people who have endured challenges, similar challenges in the past. They show less compassion for others. So we're going to talk about the empathy gap and how it impacts our ability to feel, some of the cognitive bias that is associated with it, and how our emotional state can impact us. And I think this is important because, as I was reflecting on the events over the past week, I saw all different sorts of responses and reactions to what was happening in the world, and specifically in the United States with regard to protest and things of that nature. And so from my perspective, I'm really just trying to understand. I'm trying to take a moment, pause, and understand it. And so I can now, I think after learning more about the empathy gap and how this can impact our own ability to make decisions, hopefully this will give others a good idea as to not only how this could impact our current situation, but how you can use this in your own personal development. So we're going to go through and talk a little bit about what the empathy gap is all about, but never fear, because there are always ways that we can put strategies in place to minimize those effects. The admonition to walk a mile in someone else's shoes means before judging someone, you must understand their experiences, challenges, and thought process, etc., etc. The full idiom, before you judge a man, walk a mile in his shoes. In effect, It's a reminder to practice empathy. While long credited as a Native American aphorism, replacing the word shoes with moccasins, the saying almost certainly is derived from Mary T. Lathrap's poem published in 1895. The original title of the poem was Judge Softly, later titled Walk a Mile in His Moccasins. There's many variations on this phrase, and most of you have most likely heard it. And what they say is, this is really a plea for empathy. And it is phrased and changed based on who we want to be empathetic for. But I thought this was an important thing to think about this week because it came to mind when I started to decide, when I was trying to figure out, how do I go about putting together my own strategy to deal with the events of the week? I've got an article here by Mindfuel. You can't always understand until you've walked a mile in their shoes. The person who first uttered this American saying may be lost to history. The fact that it's so well known is a good indicator of the importance of empathy in a living and meaningful life. Any intelligent discussion on humanity will, at some point, deal with the importance of truly empathizing with others to understand them completely. Here are a few notable quotes on this subject. If you learn a simple trick, Scout, you'll get along a lot better with all kinds of folks. You never really understand a person until you consider the things from his point of view, until you climb into his skin and walk around in it. It's attributed to Atticus Finch in To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee. The scene from the beloved novel depicts a father imparting some thoughts onto his young daughter on the advantages of employing empathy. As a concept, empathy is often discussed in the sense of being empathetic, makes you more compassionate to others, makes you kinder. And in a practical sense, employing empathy is also the greatest possible advantage in your ability to communicate with others in every scenario. Whenever you are about to find fault with someone, ask yourself the following question. What fault of mine most nearly resembles the one that I am about to criticize? Marcus Aurelius, Meditations. In learning to understand others, the reality is that most people act and react from ego center. In most conflicts, people act as mirrors for each other. The things that most upset us in another person is the thing we most detest in ourselves. Realizing this when we feel verbally or emotionally attacked helps us to process the other person's words without taking in so much of the blame and negativity. At the same time, we've considered this before speaking and can help to avoid conflict. I think we all have empathy. We may not have enough courage to display it. That was Maya Angelou. Maya Angelou reminds us that empathy is not some intangible characteristic that some are born with and others are not. We all have the power to truly feel another person's struggles, if only we take the time and thoughts to do so. So those are some quotes on empathy. I think based on those quotes and sayings that I hear on a daily basis, empathy, those quotes those idioms have become pretty commonplace. You know, it's something that we say to help us understand or help us think about somebody in a different light, to think about their conditions, their circumstances, and what they are going through, how we can go about understanding them a little bit better. And once we understand where they're coming from, and hopefully who they are and what they're doing, it's going to give us the ability to be empathetic. There is a problem with that, though. It's called the empathy gap. We're going to talk about that when we return. You're listening to My Strategy. I'm your host, John M. Hawkins, coming live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. When we come back, we're going to discuss the empathy gap. Not going to want to miss this. We'll be right back. Hello and welcome back, everyone. I'm John M. Hawkins. The show is My Strategy, and we're coming live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. Very happy to be here with you today on this Saturday. Episodes are live at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. Today we're talking about the empathy gap when walking a mile in someone's shoes. Right before the break, we were talking about before you judge someone, walk a mile in their shoes. I was thinking about ways that I could apply that to understanding the current situation and to be able to make some sense of what has been happening, specifically in the United States over the past week. We had a pandemic, and now we've got some protesting. People are upset, and so I was trying to understand that. And I thought that I could sum it all up with, judge someone. Before you judge them, just walk a mile in their shoes. But I ran into this interesting phenomenon called the empathy gap. And when I ran into this, it changed my entire thinking. Got an article here by Kristen Wong. It says, walking in someone else's shoes actually makes you less empathetic. Now, I was quite frankly a little bit disillusioned when I first read this because I've done shows on empathy. I've talked about being empathetic. We've talked about how to use empathy as a way to, walk with a customer, to walk with people. And when I came across this article, it just kind of shocked me. And it changed the whole tone and tenor and basically impacted what we're talking about this week, which is a good thing because I always like to be enlightened and learn more. Kristen goes on to say you're supposed to walk a mile in someone else's shoes before judging them. But as it turns out, that doesn't help. In fact, we are less empathetic to people who have endured the same troubles that we have. She goes on to say, in a study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, researchers conducted a series of experiments that measured how compassionate people were towards other people who endured similar struggles. But these other people in similar struggles had made poor decisions. For example, in one experiment, subjects were told about the story about a bullied teen. And in one scenario, the teen coped successfully. In another, the teen responded violently. In the latter scenario, researchers found that participants who'd been bullied themselves were the least compassionate about the kid who didn't cope successfully. In short, researchers came to the same basic conclusions with all the experiments. We found that people who endured challenges in the past, like divorce or being skipped over for a promotion, were less likely to show compassion for someone facing the same struggle, compared with people with no experience in that particular situation. Taken together, these results suggest that people who have endured a difficult experience are particularly likely to penalize those who struggle to cope with a similar ordeal. They say this happens for two reasons. First, there's something called an empathy gap. It basically means we tend to forget just how hard things were when we were going through them. We remember our breakup being very painful, but we still underestimate how excruciating it was at the time. So it's easy to say, I've been there, it wasn't that bad, I got through it, and they should be able to as well. Second, successfully conquering an experience kind of downplays how hard the experience can be because we can't remember it with the same intensity. We feel confident that it was at least easy enough to overcome. This, combined with the empathy gap, makes us less empathetic. And I think this is important because as we try to understand what's going on, when we see things happening on the news, when we see things coming across our social media, there is some sort of filter that we apply. And while we might want to walk in someone else's shoes and become more empathetic, if we have had similar situations, if we have been, or if we're in a different emotional state, we might not be processing their story as we would if we had never experienced that particular situation, or at least felt like we did. And I think this is important because we're seeing a wide range of responses to what is going on. And again, I'm just trying to understand this. I'm trying to figure it out. Goes on to say, this means that many people may be instinctively seeking compassion from the very people who are least likely to provide it. This clearly has implications for peer-to-peer office programs and mentorship programs, which often pair people from similar backgrounds or experiences, and they suggest that this may need to be re-examined. But there's also important lessons for leaders when approached by employees in distress. Leaders may believe that their own emotional reaction to the issue should guide their response. And how many times are we seeing this today? There is a situation going on. And do we all understand it? Do we know what's going on? I can tell you, I don't feel like I have a good handle on it. I know what I'm being told. I know that it is very difficult on many sides. And so as we start to think about our response and how we respond to this, the emotional state of ourselves, of our leaders, is really going to dictate how they go about responding. And part of this empathy gap is something that I really think we need to understand so that we can make sure that our response is thoughtful and appropriate. You're listening to My Strategy. I am your host, John M. Hawkins, coming to you live from the PBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. When we come back, we're going to talk about the empathy gap and how it impacts our ability to feel. We'll be right back. Hello and welcome back, everyone. I'm your host, John M. Hawkins, coming to you live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. Today we're talking about the empathy gap when walking a mile in someone else's shoes, talking about judging people before walking a mile in their shoes, how your emotional state matters, how the empathy gap might be causing us to misjudge and dampen our perspective. With practice, we can minimize the effect and make better decisions. Right before the break, we were talking about the empathy effect and how research has showed that compassionate people who have had a similar experience to someone, and then that someone makes a similar decision or a poor decision, they're less empathetic towards them. Because the person who is a compassionate person is really saying, I went through that, it was okay, there wasn't a big deal, and so they minimize it. So in this segment, I want to talk a little bit about the empathy gap and how it impacts our ability to feel. I've got an article here by Charlotte Beaulieu. It's called The Empathy Gap, How Walking a Mile in Someone Else's Shoes and in Your Own Shoes is Harder Than It Seems. And keep in mind that I'd come across this week because of all the things that are going on specifically this week with regard to protests. I was trying to understand it, trying to be more empathetic. And this show is all about personal development, and we've talked about empathy, and I thought I had a good handle on it. And then I came across this empathy gap. Now I want to learn more about it, and I want to see how I can apply it to help me at least think differently and try and find that right perspective when it comes to business and personal development. Charlotte starts off by saying, what if I now asked you to walk a mile in your own shoes? For example, have you ever gone grocery shopping with the intention of only buying what was on your list, but ended up buying 5 million other things that you, in hindsight, perhaps after eating, never actually needed? Were you famished while doing the grocery shopping? Has this happened to you more than once? When repeated, did you expect a different outcome from the last time you shopped while hungry? So it says the empathy gap is a cognitive bias in which people fail to understand how different mental states affect the way that other people make decisions. In other words, it's hard for someone to predict how they are going to feel and act when they're in a different emotional state than the one they are in at the moment. Therefore, you will act a certain way in a specific situation, but when actually confronted to that situation, you might not act like you thought. Furthermore, this cognitive bias results in a failure to understand someone else's point of view unless you yourself are in the same situation. We've all been through this experience. You go to the grocery store, you have a list, you eat before you go to the grocery store. Most people do pretty good. You have a list, you're starving, you go to the grocery store, you buy things that aren't on the list, and you end up making poor decisions. That's, in a nutshell, what this is about. So what they're doing is they're applying it to broader decisions and saying our emotional state has an impact. She goes on to say, well, one theory is that human understanding and cognition, the process of acquiring knowledge and understanding in state dependent, in other words, that we're feeling at a given point will impact how we react or make a decision in that moment. For example, in the grocery store scenario, because we're hungry, this visceral experience related to deep inward feelings is intuitive and not rational, and is going to impact the way we shop. However, if we were to eat before shopping, we would then likely stick to our pre-written grocery list. So that's a very simple example. She goes on to talk about the phenomenon called the hot to cold empathy gap, and there's basically different states. And I don't want to go into that into too much depth because there is a part in this article I want to get to. One thing that's interesting here that she's highlighted, and this has to do with empathy and walking a mile in someone else's shoes, is she says, if you focus on the sensation of the pain, you'll remember the pain. But do you really want to do that? And I guess the question is, why does all this matter? Well, the empathy gap can have real-world consequences when you look at it from an interpersonal perspective. These are your relationships and communication. In other words, people have a really hard time understanding or evaluating behaviors and decisions of another person when that person is in a different state, whether it's hot or cold. It says here, the effect was shown in one study where participants read a vignette about a woman who made a racial slur and were told that this was due to the lack of sleep from caring for her baby. Participants who were made to feel similarly tired at that state when the woman in the vignette, they rated the woman more positively than participants who were not so tired in this study. Therefore, by being in the same state as the woman depicted in the vignette, participants were able to put themselves in the woman's shoes and understand better why she made that racial slur. Now, this is pretty interesting to me because you've got a study and now you've changed that person's emotional state and they're responding differently to the person who did something that we would say is a poor choice. It says here that the empathy gap can have even more serious implications and negative outcomes than just being tired for a supportive friend. In a famous study by Norgren, McDonald, and Lowenstein, participants were asked to judge a specific interrogation method as being enhanced interrogation or torture. For example, participants had to submerge one arm in a bucket of ice water so they could experience pain that is similar to the cold cell interrogation method. Results showed that when participants had to judge the experience from a pain perspective, they said the cold cell interrogation method was a form of torture. However, when the participants did not have to submerge their arm in ice water, or they did it, but it was only 10 minutes, but it was 10 minutes before asking, they said the cold cell interrogation method was not a form of torture. So she says that this study goes on to prove her points. The first one being that we really do not truly understand what others are going through unless we ourselves are going through it at the exact time that they are going through it. The second point being that we really don't understand the sensory side of our visceral experiences, since only after 10 minutes of wait time have we already forgotten what kind of pain we were in. Finally, this study as a whole begs the question, how many interrogation methods in our country are currently being used? So there's more information in here, some references, but I thought it was just good to focus a little bit on some of those examples and how at some point, we all have the ability, depending on our emotional state, to respond differently in these situations. You're listening to My Strategy. I am your host, John M. Hawkins, coming to you live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. When we come back, we're going to talk about explaining the empathy gap. We'll be right back. Hello and welcome back, everyone. I'm John M. Hawkins. The show is My Strategy. We're coming to you live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. Well, if you're just joining us, welcome. Glad to have you on board. My Strategy episodes are live and on Saturdays at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. This week, we're talking about the empathy gap, and we'd love to get your thoughts on the subject. So you can send them to talk@johnmhawkins.com. That's talk@johnmhawkins.com. And the empathy gap when walking a mile in someone else's shoes. We're talking about judging people before walking a mile in their shoes, how your emotional state matters. But there's this empathy gap, which can cause us to see perspective incorrectly. But with practice, we can help minimize the effect and make better decisions. Right before the break, we were talking about the empathy gap and how it impacts our ability to feel, and how when we are in a situation similar to someone else and that someone else makes poor decisions, depending on the situation and our emotional state, we might judge them differently. Less positive, more positive. The reason we're talking about this is, this 2020's been a tough year. We had the pandemic, and then this past week we've had a lot of protests going on. And, from my perspective, I'm just trying to figure out how to go about processing this information. My strategy is all about personal development and helping provide those tools. And so that really is what this show is about this week. So we're talking about this empathy gap and how it can help us, fail to see things in the right perspective. And I got an article here from Effectivology. It's called The Empathy Gap, Why People Fail to Understand Different Perspective. It says the empathy gap is a cognitive bias that makes it difficult for people to account for the manner in which differences in mental states affect the way that they and other people make decisions. And if you're just joining us, the most basic example is when you go to the grocery store with a list. If you go to the grocery store with a list and you have not eaten for 24 hours, your behavior in the grocery store is going to be much different than if you go to the grocery store with a list and you ate 30 minutes before you walked into the grocery store. Impulse buying, getting whatever you want off the shelves. And do you get your list? Maybe, maybe not. But that's what's happening here with regard to this topic. And what happens is they're applying it more broadly to other emotional states that we go through. It says here, for example, when it comes to misjudging your own perspective, when a person who is dieting feels full, they struggle to assess how well they will be able to handle the temptation to eat certain foods later. When they're hungry, similarly, that person who is feeling calm at the moment will find difficult to accurately predict how they will act if someone angers them. Hangry, you've heard of that, right? Furthermore, when it comes to misjudging other people's perspective, a person who is feeling relaxed and safe will often struggle to imagine the perspective of someone who is feeling threatened. Similarly, a person who is looking to fight over something will find it difficult to imagine that others might prefer a peaceful solution. I think this is important. And this, to me, is what I was trying to understand this week. Protests are going on. There's a whole wide range of responses. And in reading this paragraph here, a person who is feeling relaxed and safe will struggle to imagine the perspective of someone who is feeling threatened. Similarly, a person who is looking to fight will find it difficult to imagine others that might prefer a peaceful solution. Well, depending on the emotional state you are in and where you are, it provides us the ability to, we're going to respond based on that. The problem is that with social media, we're no longer in the same room hearing the same conversation in the same emotional state. You have people who are in one emotional state in the comfort of their home, and they are in that state, and they respond. You have other people who are, as a result of the pandemic, hungry. They don't have a job. They're worried. They're concerned. So they're not in the same emotional state. And they have the ability on social media to respond. You have other groups who are marching and in the middle of protests, and they do feel threatened. They do feel that they might have just witnessed violence, and they respond on social media. So what happens is we have all of these people who are in different situations, and in a normal, with non-social media world, you would respond to those in the room, and people, you could kind of understand where you're coming from because you're all on that same path. You're all on that same journey. In the case with social media, people are in completely different emotional states. And I think this is one of the reasons why we're having a hard time understanding somebody else's perspective. Why we're having a hard time walking a mile in their moccasins, walking a mile in their Nikes or shoes. And it's because part of it, I think, is that we are in different states and then we get on social media and we start to share. And as a result of that, there seems to be, it looks like we don't understand another person's perspective. It goes on to say the empathy gap will make it difficult for people to imagine how they will feel. This means that the empathy gap can cause people to be unprepared for situations that are affected by various emotional considerations that cause them to do things which satisfy their instincts, urges, cravings in the short term, but which fail to help them accomplish their longer-term goals or to act in the way they would ideally preferred. I think this is very important for us as strategists, as people who are looking to develop personally. There's the short-term response to satisfy instinct, urges, and cravings. There's the long-term response, which is more ideal. And so really what we need to do is we need to find a way to get the information so that we can determine, is this an emotional or a rational choice? And hopefully in doing so, we can make the best choice. You're listening to My Strategy. I'm your host, John M. Hawkins, coming to you live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. When we come back, we're going to talk about some of the types of things we can do to minimize this effect. We'll be right back. Hello and welcome back, everyone. I'm your host, John M. Hawkins. We're coming to you live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. The show is called My Strategy. This week, we're talking about a pretty important subject. It's the empathy gap when walking a mile in someone else's shoes. Talking about judging a person, not judging a person before we walk a mile in their shoes. Right before the break, we were talking about the empathy gap and talking about how all of that works. And hopefully we've come to realize up to this point in the show that the empathy gap is something that we really do need to be cognizant about and of. So in this segment, I want to talk a little bit about how do we minimize the effects. Now, one thing I didn't get to, and I'm not going to get to it this week, but it's the different types of empathy gaps that are out there. I think it's important for us to, if you're interested in the subject, to go out there and learn about those different types, whether it's hot and cold, cold or hot. But we're just not going to get to it, not enough time. So what I want to talk about is, how do we account for this empathy gap? And I'm continuing on with the article I was talking about in the prior segment from Effective Theology on the subject. So it says, how to account for empathy gap. So far, we saw what the empathy gap is, why we experience it, and what type of it exists. Well, you don't know what type because we didn't talk about that. Next, they want to give us some techniques that we can use to reduce the influence in various situations. And they said, for convenience, these techniques are generally written with a focus on one of the main types of the empathy gap, namely cold to hot, intrapersonal perspective bias, which represents our difficulty to predict how our emotional and visceral impulses will impact us in the future. However, while reading about these techniques, remember that the empathy gap can play a role not only in the way we predict our future behavior, but also in the way we examine our past actions, as well as in the way we consider other people's actions. And furthermore, the empathy gap can occur not only in cold to hot direction, but also in hot to cold direction, as we saw above. And again, we didn't talk about cold to hot or hot to cold. So maybe something for a different show. So they say visualize the different mental states and perspectives. One way to minimize the empathy gap is by trying to visualize exactly how you will feel when you're in a different mental state than the one you're in at the moment. Essentially, this means that instead of trying to predict how you will act, you need to start by actively trying to imagine how you will feel. So it's not the action, but the feeling before you can move on. Before you can move on to trying to predict your future behavior. So what this means with our grocery store example is when you're thinking about going to the grocery store, and you know you're not going to eat 24 hours before you get in there, and you have your list, think about it from a hunger perspective. Get yourself into that emotional state where you are hungry, and that is what is going to help you see it differently, rather than, eating dinner, writing the grocery list, not really having the perspective, and then going to the grocery store the next day without. Now, very, very simple example here. I realize that the problems we're dealing with in life this week, every week, are very complicated, but it kind of gives you the idea of what to do. Also, they say think about how people would act. If you're trying to account for empathy gap when it comes to predicting your own behavior, it can sometimes be helpful to imagine how other people would act under similar circumstances. For example, instead of asking yourself whether you will be able to stick with a certain diet, ask yourselves how likely someone else would be able to stick with that diet under the same set of circumstances that you would have had to handle, even though you might assume that you will be able to handle it due to wishful thinking. By asking yourself how likely someone else is able to handle it, you'll be able to examine the situation in a more emotionally and neutrally biased way. And that makes sense, right? How many people in this world have been on a diet at one time or another? I assume every hand would go up. Maybe there's a few that haven't, and that's possible. I know for example, a diet is, to me, it's just what you eat, and sometimes I eat better, sometimes I don't. And, but if you think about it from that perspective, if I'm thinking about what am I going to eat this week, what am I going to eat tonight, tomorrow, I'm going to have certain emotional connection to the food that I'm going to eat. But if I think about it from the perspective of, what's that top runner over there, Olympian runner going to eat, or what's that weightlifter going to eat, or what's that, other person over here going to eat, then you can take that emotion out of it. So that sounds like a good tactic to me and something that might work. The other thing they say you can do is consider past actions. One of the main reasons why we're experiencing empathy gaps is the fact that we all try to predict our future behaviors, but we often try to imagine how we will feel while ignoring our past actions, which are the best indicators of how we will act in reality. For example, let's say you want to stick with your diet. One of your goals is to avoid eating snacks while you're at work. However, you know that every day around 2 p.m., you go get some fresh coffee from the break room and also end up eating one of the fresh pastries that are kept in there, thus failing your goal of maintaining your diet. Because of the empathy gap, you might overestimate your ability to resist those pastries, even though you've failed to do so many times in the past. And there's other techniques you can use. They're using this as an example, but there's certain triggers you can put in place so that when you do go to get your coffee, you don't grab the pastry. And we've talked about that in other shows, but just some other ideas that they've thrown out there with regard to it. Other ways to reduce the empathy gap is, since it's based on a cognitive bias that we experience due to the way our cognitive system works, it can be countered using the same debiasing methods that are used in order to counter other cognitive biases. And these methods, for example, increasing your awareness of the bias, slowing down your reasoning response, and increasing your personal accountability. And there's many, many more things. So hopefully that gives you an idea on some of the things we can use to build our strategy to reduce it. You're listening to My Strategy. I'm your host, John M. Hawkins, coming to you live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. When we come back, we're going to talk about how to put your strategy in place. Be right back. Hello and welcome back, everyone. I'm your host, John M. Hawkins. We're coming to you live from the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. Show is called My Strategy. It's live on Saturdays at 10 a.m. Pacific, 1 p.m. Eastern. And if you've missed this broadcast, you can listen on iHeartRadio and Apple iTunes or many other digital platforms. Just do a search out there, a Google search. And if you'd like to have something covered on the show, send an email to talk@johnmhawkins.com. That's talk@johnmhawkins.com, or just give us a call at 844-MY-STRATEGY. That's 1-844-MY-STRATEGY. This week we've been talking about the empathy gap when walking a mile in someone's shoes. Talking about judging people before walking a mile in their shoes, how your emotional state matters, and the empathy gap causes us to misjudge perspective. With practice, you can minimize this effect and make better decisions. Well, this week's episode was really, we've had a tough 2020. And, we've got the pandemic. There's so many other things going on in life. And this past week has been very difficult with protests. So I was thinking about how do I go about responding? How do I go about reacting to what is going on? And I had a very difficult time coming up with any sort of response. And so I thought, well, one of the simplest way to do it is to be empathetic for a person. And I thought about, don't judge someone until you've walked a mile in their shoes, right? We must understand someone's experiences, their challenges. What was their thought process at the time? In effect, it's a reminder really for us to be empathetic. And this judging someone, before you judge someone walk a mile in their shoes, has a long-standing tradition, Native American aphorism, walk a mile in the moccasins. There's others as well. But I ran across something that really started to get me to think twice, and it was this empathy gap. Now, researchers studied how compassionate people reacted differently to those who made poor decisions if they had some experience. People who had endured challenges in the past were much less compassionate than others because we forget how hard things were when we went through them. And so the empathy gap is something that is real, and it impacts our ability to feel. And this cognitive bias in which people fail to understand others' different mental states can really impact our decision-making. How we feel at a certain place, time impacts our decision-making. If we focus on the sensation of the pain, you'll remember the pain, but do we really want to? And it all came to light when I thought about social media and how people are in different emotional states throughout the country. Some are happy, some are sad, Some are in violent situations, some are not. And when we see when we see one word sentence, when we see a short phrase or somebody put something on social media, we never really understand exactly where they are from an emotional and physical perspective. And I think all of that impacts how we process that data. So one of the things I learned this week is that it's really important for me to start to minimize that effect as I start to process and look at what's going on in our country. Start to think about how there's different perspective and how to understand not only where people are physically, but emotionally, what is their state? What has happened in their past to make them or to cause them to make the decisions that they're making today. So I don't think there's one real answer for it in an hour-long show, but I can tell you that learning more about the empathy gap will definitely help you to think differently about your own life, your own perspective, and hopefully it will put you in a position to make better decisions so that when you are faced with trying to walk a mile in someone else's moccasins, you do understand that there is this empathy gap that's out there. And when you have the tools in place to mitigate and minimize it, you have a much greater chance for success. Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Wishing you a great week. You've been listening to my strategy, coming live on the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. I'm John Hawkins, and we'll see you next time.